Here's a guy who thinks that there's evidence that God exists.
Today's video is going to be a sort of follow-up to my most recent video, which was a response video to Ricky Gervais on atheism. Now, it's not a follow-up to anything I said or he said specifically, but rather it is a response to a comment that consistently showed up in that comment thread. And not only in my video, but I noticed this comment, claim, assertion is made very, very, very frequently in videos between atheists and theists. And so I figure, hey, it popped up enough in my video alone, and I've seen this claim made for a long time. I might as well do a video specifically responding to this one point. And I think this claim is just in error, right? I think it's false. I think it's demonstrably false. And quickly to kind of even bolster this is that the more philosophically informed atheists are going to agree with me on this point, right?
I have a degree in philosophy, and I'm not going to agree with you on this point.
Somebody like Alex O'Connor, right, who's still definitely, well, I think he's an agnostic now, but he's going to agree with me on this point. He's not going to agree with me that God exists or Christianity is true, but he's going to agree with me on this point. And all of the atheist philosophers who are studying in this area, the philosophy of religion, those who are actually doing the groundwork, examining the arguments for and against God's existence or Christianity, they're going to agree with me on this specific point.
Nope. As one of those atheists, I can assure you that this is not universally true.
Right? But it's not that they're going to agree with me on everything. And you might say, well, then what's the point of getting us to agree on this one point if it doesn't lead to believing in God? Well, because I think in these discussions, if the pursuit or if the goal is truth on both ends, then as we're having these discourses and these dialogues, the more sort of dead wood that we can chop off along the way is going to make these arguments more fruitful. And they're going to lead to hopefully better conclusions, right? On both parts. We're going to be able to more clearly see what we agree on and what we disagree on. And the closer two parties can get, the more likely they are to come to some sort of agreement, right? Or at least find the problems on either person's view.
Yeah, it would be great if theists could present a definition of God that isn't self-contradictory. Once you have a definition of God that's coherent, then we can begin to discuss whether there's evidence for the existence of such a God. Until then, the examination of evidence can't even take place because there can't be evidence for incoherent claims.
And so, if there's bad claims, just kind of silly assertions that are being made on either end, this would apply to claims that are also made from Christians or theists that probably should be stopped being used as well against atheists, right? But the purpose of this video is specifically to focus on this one point, and that is the claim that there is no evidence for God's existence or for Christianity, right? We're going to more broadly focus on God's existence.
In order to thoroughly test whether there is evidence of God, I'm going to use a very broad, generous definition of evidence. Let's say that the evidence for the truth of a claim is anything that could conceivably be a consequence of that claim being true. By this definition, you could say that there is evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, but still no evidence of God. If Jesus rose from the dead, it is easily conceivable that someone would claim that he rose from the dead, therefore to merely claim that Jesus rose from the dead is evidence of that claim's truth according to my very broad, generous, and charitable definition. However, even by this definition of evidence, there is not and could not be evidence of God, because in order for there to be a conceivable consequence of a claim being true, the claim itself has to be conceivably true, and the idea of a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind that created all of time and space is not conceivable. It is a self-contradictory notion.
Because this is a claim that's mainly made in that regard. And so what's the problem here? What's the problem with this claim? Why do I have such issue with it? And why do most philosophically informed atheists agree that this claim is false? Well, I think to start, it's just the term evidence itself. I think there's a misunderstanding on what evidence is. Okay, and so I think what's going on here is that for those of you atheists who make this claim or use this argument, it's not really an argument, but I think you have the misunderstanding that evidence entails something being true, right? Or the evidence is synonymous with proof or something like that, right?
Nope, that's not my understanding of what evidence is. Even by the very broad definition of evidence that I stipulated, there is and can never be evidence of God, at least not as long as he is defined as being capable of existing independent of time and space and being the creator of time and space. I don't know how such a notion isn't self-contradictory.
I think your fear is that if you say there's evidence for God's existence, then that means God exists.
That's not my position, and it never has been. By the definition of evidence that I gave, there is evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. I still don't think it actually happened.
But that's just to misunderstand how evidence works. And we'll come back to this idea of how it specifically relates to God in this discussion, but just to quickly show a sort of real-world practical example that we can all sort of agree on. Just imagine a court trial, right? You have the defendant and you have the prosecutor. Both the defense and the prosecution are going to make a case, and they're going to put forward evidence to the judge or to the jury to sort of make their case. Now, both sides have evidence, but both sides are not correct, right?
No, but I suspect it's pretty rare that one side is trying to present evidence of a claim that is altogether nonsensical.
Clearly, the person can't be guilty and not guilty. They're either guilty or they're not guilty, but that doesn't stop both sides from putting forward evidence. And so you might think, okay, well, how can that be? And again, this is why it's not true that evidence means that something is true. All evidence means is that it is a data point, you might say, that is consistent or expected on a given hypothesis.
Right, and there can't possibly be a data point consistent with the hypothesis that a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind that created the universe exists. There can be no more data points consistent with that claim than there can be data points consistent with the claim that married bachelors exist.
Okay, so like in the case of, I don't know, quickly, let's say we've got Bob, and he is accused of robbing a bank, and both sides are going to put forward evidence for why Bob's guilty or not guilty. The prosecution might say something like, well, Bob's car was seen within a half mile of the bank within 30 minutes of that time frame. So it's like, okay, that's evidence in favor of Bob robbing the bank. And why? Well, because it's consistent with the hypothesis that Bob robbed the bank.
Right, but what could possibly be consistent with a contradictory statement being true?
Because Bob's car would have to be within the vicinity of the bank for him to be able to rob it, right? Assuming he's driving his own car. You get my point here. But it doesn't prove that Bob robbed the bank, right? Okay, and so now maybe the defense is going to put forward this data point or this piece of evidence that Bob was wearing a green shirt that day, whereas the claims from the eyewitnesses are that the bank robber, was wearing a red shirt that they could see maybe under like a black hoodie or something. But we know we have, let's say, picture video proof that Bob was wearing a green shirt prior to that. And so how is that evidence that Bob is innocent? Well, because on the hypothesis that Bob robbed the bank, the data point that is expected is that Bob would be wearing a red shirt, because that would be consistent with the claims of the eyewitnesses.
In other words, the witnesses claiming that the robber wore a red shirt is not a conceivable consequence of Bob wearing a green shirt.
So hopefully you can kind of see the point here. The point here is just to show that evidence isn't conclusive, right? You can have evidence for a theory or a hypothesis without it being true.
Sure, but with respect to God, we can't even have evidence that the claims of his existence are true, let alone proof.
Now, quickly, to zoom in on the discussion here regarding God, one of the points that I made in the last video, so we'll just use this, is this idea of consciousness, and how I said consciousness is evidence for God.
How is consciousness, which is something that a brain does, evidence of the existence of a consciousness without a brain? That's like saying that the fact that digestive systems digest things is evidence that digestion can occur without a digestive system. That makes no sense.
Now, how is it evidence for God? Well, the reason why consciousness is evidence for God is because it is expected on the hypothesis that God exists, or it is consistent with the hypothesis that God exists.
Exactly the opposite. The fact that brains carry out the activity of consciousness is in no way consistent with the idea that consciousness can just occur without anything carrying it out. Unless your definition of God is consistent with God having some kind of brain that carries out cognitive functions, the existence of God is totally inconsistent with the idea that consciousness exists.
Now, I think this is just self-evidently true, right? But to try to flesh this out and give a bit better of a justification, let's do that. Well, okay, the reason it's expected or consistent with the hypothesis that God exists is that The claim that theists make is that God is essentially an all-powerful mind, right?
More relevantly, they claim that God is a disembodied mind. He is a mind that is conscious without a brain to carry out that consciousness. This makes no sense. Consciousness consists entirely of activities. It's thinking, feeling, perceiving, deliberating, etc. These are actions, and actions can't occur without some actor carrying them out. The claim that a mind can exist without a brain is essentially claiming that actions can occur without any actor carrying them out. It's a contradiction.
And so God would have this experience of being sort of conscious, right? He's a mind. And so if God has this mind, right, conscious experience, then it would follow that this thing is valuable.
Why? Is it valuable just because God has it? If the standard by which you measure value is God, then saying that anything God has is valuable is a meaningless tautology.
And so if it's valuable, when God creates a world and he creates creatures, he's going to create things that have value. And if there's value in having consciousness and or a mind, then we have this expectance that God would give his creatures consciousness.
By that logic, we should expect him to give everything consciousness. He created rocks, so he would give rocks consciousness, right?
And so even in this case, it's not even saying that if God exists, he would definitively create creatures with consciousness. No, it's conceivable that God could create a world where creatures aren't conscious, but it's still consistent, and it's at least expected on the hypothesis that God exists that he would create conscious creatures. And so another secondary point here that I want to make to sort of illustrate the point here is that like the Big Bang Theory, right? Just the theory that says that the universe began to exist. Okay, I know typically this is called the Kalam. What we read in Genesis is sort of that God creates the world from nothing, right? This idea of creation ex nihilo.
It doesn't actually say that. When Genesis says that God created the heavens and the earth, it does not say that nothing existed prior to that.
I know some people would even disagree with that, but just the consistent Christian tradition is that God creates ex nihilo, from nothing. And so this idea of the universe beginning to exist spontaneously is consistent with the claims of Christianity, right?
The idea that the universe had a beginning is consistent with the hypothesis that time began at the Big Bang, although that's disputed, but it's not consistent with the idea that the universe had a creator. Even if time hasn't existed infinitely, there was never a time when time did not exist, and since it's impossible to create something at a time when it already exists, time cannot have a creator.
That God exists and that he's this all-powerful mind that can do anything, and then given what our book teaches that God creates out of nothing, this data point would be expected on theism and even on Christianity. And so hopefully this illustrates sort of the point of the video, right? And that is just to say that Christianity, theism does have evidence, and you should grant that it has evidence.
It doesn't, though, and it couldn't possibly have evidence unless you drastically redefine what you mean by God.
But by granting that, you're not granting that it's true. So that's okay. You still maintain your belief in atheism. I know you're going to say it's not a belief. That's fine. You still maintain the position of atheism.
I will grant that there is the weakest possible evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, even though it isn't even remotely enough to convince me that it happened. The strength of the evidence that Jesus rose from the dead is comparable to the strength of the evidence that Muhammad rode a flying horse.
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.